You have been drinking Coca-Cola your whole life. You think you understand it. But one night in Atlanta, a car stopped in the wrong place, right at the edge of a privately owned estate spanning dozens of acres. Inside were two bodies, a man, a woman, and a gun that did not belong to either of them. Behind that car stood a mansion most Americans had never seen. No sign, no open gate, no explanation. If you think this was just an isolated crime, you've already missed the most important part, because that place was not just a house. It was the unofficial center of power behind a consumer empire worth billions of dollars. While millions of Americans held a Coca-Cola bottle that cost only a few cents, not far away, decisions were being made in silence. No records, no titles, no public accountability. Then a murder happened, and strangely, the story almost vanished from public history. No thorough investigation, no complete explanation. Only gaps that money seemed to blur. What caused a place of such power to nearly disappear from memory? Why a legacy tied to joy, refreshment, and childhood carries such a heavy shadow? And if the truth was once covered up, who benefited from that silence? This is not just a story about a mansion. It is a story about a system, about how power operates behind walls the public is never allowed to cross. If you stay until the end of this video, you will see how an American dream was built, how it nearly collapsed, and why, even today, this story has never been fully told. But to understand that, we have to go back to the moment it all began. When a man named Asa Candler decided to build not just a brand for the world, but a kingdom the world was never meant to see. If you want to keep uncovering the hidden power behind familiar icons, like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. Why was a brand meant for everyone run from a world almost no one was allowed to enter? Atlanta, late 19th century. A southern city still trapped in the shadow of the Civil War. Red dust on the streets, low wooden houses. Money was scarce. Power rested in very few hands. While most Atlantans crowded into small homes, on the northeastern edge of the city, a piece of land began to be fenced off. Tall fences, heavy gates, no nameplates, no signs. This would later be known as Briarcliff. The man behind the land was Asa Candler. He was not the inventor of Coca-Cola, not a scientist, not a glamorous figure of his era. Asa Candler was a businessman, a man who understood the value of control. He did not see Coca-Cola as a drink, but as a habit that could be repeated every day. In 1888, he bought the full formula and ownership of Coca-Cola for about $2,300. A number that sounds small, even at the time. Back then, $2,300 could buy a modest wooden house on the outskirts of Atlanta, or pay a laborer's wages for several years, or purchase a few strong horses and a solid wagon. It was not enough to build a large factory, not enough to buy dozens of acres of land, not enough to build an empire, but it was enough to buy a formula, a name, and absolute control. This decision changed everything. From that moment on, Coca-Cola was no longer just a drink. It became an asset, and power began accumulating from a deal that seemed harmless. Coca-Cola sold for just a few cents. Anyone could afford it. Anyone could drink it. But the place where the man who controlled it lived was the opposite. Briarcliff was not built like a home. It was designed as a controlled zone. Long entrances, obstructed sightlines, indirect pathways. Strangers stood out immediately. As Coca-Cola spread from Atlanta to the south and then across the United States, Briarcliff expanded with it. Dozens of acres, multiple auxiliary buildings, housing for servants completely separated from the main living quarters. Servants did not share entrances, did not share schedules, did not share space. This was not convenience. This was hierarchy. And it was here that the private meetings began. Not public parties, no invitations, no newspaper mentions. According to fragmented records that remain, guests often arrived at Briarcliff in the evening. By horse carriage, later by automobile, entering through side gates. No one in Atlanta was informed who they were. No one knew how long they stayed. No one knew what those conversations covered. Only that the next morning, certain decisions took effect. No documents, no signatures, no trace. Briarcliff was not a government building. But it functioned as an unofficial center of power. Conversations took place behind closed doors. No minutes, no recordings, no evidence. And this is the key point. When power does not need to appear in public, it becomes far harder to control. By then, Coca-Cola was no longer a small business. Revenue grew, influence expanded. Asa Candler's name surfaced in Atlanta's political and social networks. But real power did not live in the newspapers. It lived behind the fences of Briarcliff. This created a clear moral contradiction, a brand fueled by public affection. Yet its power operated in silence, and that silence was not accidental. Decisions made at Briarcliff could affect the entire city, yet the people of the city never knew how or why. The more successful it became, the more Briarcliff closed itself off. The richer it grew, the wider the gap became, and a question began to form. If it only took $2,300 to buy an empire, what was the real cost society paid? But this was still not Briarcliff's deepest mystery. Because power, once accumulated long enough in the dark, rarely stops at private dinners and quiet deals. And this is where the story turns. Because what happened next was no longer just about power. It involved violence, death, and a night Briarcliff could no longer fully conceal. But this is where the story turns. What happens when power accustomed to darkness first encounters violence? Atlanta, one winter night in the early 20th century. Fog blanketed the roads leading to the outskirts. Gas lamps cast a dull yellow glow. The silence was so deep you could hear wheels crunching on gravel. A car stopped at the edge of the Briarcliff estate, not at the main gate, not at a designated entrance, as if it did not belong there. Inside were two people, a man, a woman, and they were dead. According to records released later, the gun found in the car did not belong to either victim. No one could explain why it was there. No one could explain why the car stopped precisely at the boundary of private land. And no one could explain why the case was so quickly downplayed. This was not a crime in the city center, not in a working-class neighborhood, not where police routinely handled homicides. It happened next to one of the most powerful estates in Atlanta, and that made all the difference. Under normal circumstances, a case like this would trigger a prolonged investigation, conflicting testimonies, names appearing in newspapers for weeks. But in this case, the story appeared and then disappeared. No widely circulated crime scene photos. No sustained public questioning. No one stepping forward to explain. Only short, careful news items. Vague, avoiding detail. And Atlanta moved on as if nothing had happened. This was the moment power revealed a dangerous flaw. A system built to operate in silence was never designed to confront public violence. The identities of those entering and leaving Briarcliff at that night were never released. Private meetings near the time of the murder were never discussed. Connections between money, power, and people were severed from the official narrative. According to unverified accounts, some witnesses reported lights on in the main house at unusually late hours. These accounts were never confirmed, never included in official files, but never disproven. They survived only at the edges of the truth, and that was the most dangerous part. Because when no one clearly explains what happened, questions begin to surface. If this was random, why wasn't it investigated like other cases? If it had nothing to do with Briarcliff, why did it happen at its boundary? And if power was not involved, why did silence arrive so quickly? This still does not explain the real mystery, because the murder was not the only thing that disappeared. Trust disappeared with it. In the years that followed, Briarcliff was no longer just known as a luxurious mansion. It became surrounded by whispers, about doors that never opened, about meetings held too late into the night, about decisions no one took responsibility for. No one said Briarcliff caused the murder, but no one dared say it was innocent either. That ambiguity created a deep moral tension. An empire built on pleasure, unable to confront tragedy. Power strong enough to control space, but not transparent enough to accept responsibility. From that moment on, Briarcliff was no longer just a residence. It became a symbol of a dangerous boundary between influence and manipulation, between silence and concealment, between legitimate authority and power beyond oversight. And the most unsettling part was this. There was no sign the system would stop itself. But this is where the story deepens. The murder did not immediately destroy Briarcliff. It created a crack, a small crack, quiet, but irreversible. That crack widened over time, through subsequent decisions, through shifts in control, and through the way society slowly reconsidered what it had once ignored. To understand why Briarcliff could no longer remain what it was, we have to look at what happened next. Not overnight, but over many years. This decision changed everything. Why a power once strong enough to silence an entire city began to collapse. After the murder, Briarcliff did not fall apart. But it was no longer whole. The first thing to disappear was not money. It was certainty. Asa Candler's power was never based on formal authority. He did not control through documents, through law, through institutions. He controlled through personal presence. Who was invited to Briarcliff? Who was not? Who received private meetings? Who remained outside? Everything revolved around one man, and that was the kingdom's fatal flaw. As Asa Candler withdrew from public life, as his health declined, as private gatherings became less frequent, the system lost its axis. No one possessed enough authority to replace him. Successors had wealth, but they lacked the fear his name once inspired. No one was sure anymore whether a conversation at Briarcliff still carried weight. And when certainty fades, power begins to slip. Some political connections kept their distance. Some agreements lost priority. Some nighttime meetings stopped altogether. The walls remained tall. But people no longer needed to pass through them. This decision changed everything, because power does not survive on memory. It survives on present effectiveness. At the same time, another force eroded Briarcliff. A new generation of power was emerging in Atlanta. Younger entrepreneurs, investors detached from old loyalties. People no longer intimidated by closed rooms. They operated with contracts, with shares, with new rules. Briarcliff belonged to an older era, a place where power depended on who sat in the room, not what was written down. When the rules changed, Briarcliff became obsolete. But what made it truly fragile was the unresolved memory of the murder. Not enough to destroy the mansion, but enough to make people wary. No one wanted their name tied to a place with an unfinished story. A power once built on silence was now being eroded by that same silence. Then economic pressure arrived. Briarcliff was not just symbolic, it was expensive. Dozens of acres, high maintenance costs, a layout unsuited to modern life. A mansion built to display personal power did not adapt well once that power faded. Keeping Briarcliff was no longer an advantage. It became a burden. And this was the pivotal moment. The decision to let go of Briarcliff was not because of financial need, but because it no longer produced power. A place once used to control could no longer control anything. When power retreated, space changed hands, and that transfer marked the end of a private kingdom. But this is where the story turns again. Briarcliff was not destroyed. It was repurposed. And when a place built to conceal power opens itself to the public, a new question emerges. Does light erase darkness? Or does it simply reveal what was always there? How Briarcliff actually ended, and who rewrote its story. As Asa Candler's influence declined, Briarcliff was no longer a place where decisions were made. But it was still too large an asset to abandon. Dozens of acres, a massive mansion, high upkeep, a legacy filled with contradictions. The Candler family faced a new dilemma. Keeping Briarcliff no longer brought influence, but selling it risked releasing old stories into unfamiliar hands. So a different choice was made. Briarcliff was not sold to another private family. It was transferred to a religious institution. The decision was quiet. No press conference, no detailed explanation, but it completely altered the estate's fate. From a private kingdom, Briarcliff became Briarcliff College, a religious school for women. Rooms once used for late-night meetings became classrooms. Corridors designed to control movement turned into shared spaces. The structure remained. The purpose reversed. But one thing did not change. There was no official effort to fully document what had come before. The murder that once shook Atlanta never appeared in the school's official history. The private meetings were not mentioned. Briarcliff was redefined without confronting its past. This decision erased more than it preserved. Years later, as educational models changed, Briarcliff College closed. The estate changed hands again. This time it became a medical facility, a hospital. Rooms once associated with power now dealt with life and death in a different way. Restricted areas remained closed, but for clinical reasons. Asa Candler's name faded from daily use. Coca-Cola was no longer discussed, yet the old power structure remained embedded in the architecture. And this is the most important detail. Briarcliff was never fully preserved as a historical landmark. No plaques telling the complete story. No tours addressing the controversial past. No effort to publicly reconcile what had been concealed. It was used, not explained. Which means the story did not end in collapse. It ended in memory being edited. A place once defined by silent power was handed to institutions assumed to be moral. Not to judge that choice as right or wrong, but to recognize how deliberately the past was softened. This is the final tension. A legacy can be saved without confronting the full truth. A space can continue to exist without telling its entire story. And when you walk through Briarcliff's gates today, you enter a place that has been rewritten. Not through lies, but through omission. Briarcliff still stands. Not demolished. Not erased from Atlanta's map. But what disappeared is how it once operated. A mansion built to control personal power. A space where decisions were made beyond public view. A place once sealed enough for a murder to pass without clear accountability. Today, Briarcliff bears a different name, a different purpose, a different narrative. No one lies about it, but no one tells everything either. There is no sign explaining that this was once Atlanta's unofficial center of power. No public record fully connecting a mass-market Coca-Cola to the closed doors that shaped its rise. History here was not erased. It was blurred. And that is what makes Briarcliff unforgettable. Because it did not fall through scandal. It did not end with a verdict. It was not publicly condemned by history. It was simply rewritten. An empire that began with $2,300 grew powerful enough to shape a city, and quiet enough to withdraw without answering every question. So what remains? Not architecture, not land, but an unrecorded lesson. That power does not always need visibility, that the most consequential decisions are sometimes made in rooms no one is invited into. And that silence, sustained long enough, can become part of a legacy. When you drink a bottle of Coca-Cola, you do not think of Briarcliff. But Briarcliff was once where a portion of the power behind that world operated. And the final question is not about the past. It is about the present. If a place like Briarcliff could exist for so long with so little scrutiny, how many other gates today are still closed right in front of us? If you believe stories behind power deserve to be examined, subscribe to the channel and continue exploring legacies built not only from stone and money, but from what was kept silent. An administrative decision is approved. A demolition permit is signed. Heavy machinery waits in front of a 17-acre estate, 126 rooms, tens of thousands of antique objects, a structure built to last forever, lavish beyond belief, and too expensive to keep alive. Not war, not natural disaster, but cold numbers on a balance sheet push it to the edge. The annual operating costs exceed what any owner can reasonably carry. The government calls it a burden. Buyers call it a risk. In history, very few mansions disappear because they were poor. Mar-a-Lago nearly became one of them. If it had fallen, it would not have been just the loss of a house. It would have marked the end of a model of power where architecture, money, and privilege once moved together. This story is not about wealth. It is about the price required to keep a symbol alive. If you are interested in stories of legacy, power, and the hidden cost of luxury, like the video and subscribe to the channel. But to understand why Mar-a-Lago once stood on the brink, we have to go back in time, long before gilded walls, before this place even had a name on the map. Accident economy. When Palm Beach was still barely surviving, September Mot, Mot Ngin Tam Tram, Bay Moi Tam. Off the coast of Florida, a Spanish ship ran aground. Its name was Providencia. The hull broke apart on the sand. Cargo crates burst open. 20,000 coconuts spilled into the surf and washed ashore on a narrow, unnamed barrier island. At the time, this place was not Palm Beach. It was sand, scrub, brackish water, and mosquitoes. A few settler families lived here in crude wooden houses, floors raised on stilts to escape the tide. Fresh water came from rain barrels or had to be brought in from elsewhere. When storms arrived, roofs could be torn away overnight. When the wreck appeared, no one ran to rescue the crew. The sailors had already abandoned ship. People came because anything edible, sellable, or plantable had value here. Coconuts were split open on the beach for drinking water. Others were loaded onto rough carts and hauled away. Then they were planted in the sand like long-term bets with no guarantees. The coconut palm was not native to Florida, but it survived. And as the trees took hold, the shoreline began to change. Visitors from the north arriving in winter noticed first not hardship, but straight rows of palms, long shadows, and a tropical feeling. The name Palm Beach emerged as a kind of accidental branding born from a shipwreck. But a name did not make life easier. Through the 1880s, the area remained isolated. Supplies depended on small boats, arriving late, incomplete, or not at all. There were no real roads, only sand tracks. And even inside this place that sounded like paradise, a quiet boundary already existed. Not a line on a map, but a line in daily life. On the island, a handful of winter visitors stayed in a small hotel, ate rare hot meals, slept under mosquito nets. Across the lagoon, black laborers lived in a settlement known as sticks, crowded into small houses, doing the heavy work rarely mentioned, rowing back and forth, cleaning, repairing roofs, keeping everything presentable when guests arrived. Paradise here was not built with stone. It was held together by labor. And then the rhythm of the story changed. Spring, Mot Ngin Tam Tram, Chin Mui Ba. A 63-year-old man stepped onto the sand and looked at it like a blueprint. His name was Henry Morrison Flagler. He came from Ohio, shaped by America's industrial boom. He did not build his fortune in land or banking. He built it in oil. Standard Oil was an empire of refining and distribution, supplying kerosene, the fuel that lit millions of American homes before electricity became widespread. It controlled the chain from refinery to transport to market, a level of power that forced railroads and ports to comply. Flagler did not just have money. He had experience turning raw material into systems that scaled. He had already tested that formula in St. Augustine and won, building luxury hotels, then extending rail lines so wealthy guests could move directly from private rail cars into comfort without touching the harshness of Florida. Now he stood here, a place still poor, thinly settled, and unstable. But Flagler did not see poverty. He saw what every oil man looks for: infrastructure and control. The decision he was about to make would transform this strip of sand into the winter capital of American wealth and lock Palm Beach into a social structure it would carry for generations. And that leads to the real question. Who was this paradise built for, and who paid the price to keep it running? Flagler builds the stage, February Motenendum Tram, Chinmuibon, Palm Beach, Florida. On February Moimot, the Royal Poinciana Hotel officially opens. Not a hotel, a complex, more than 1,000 rooms, stretching hundreds of meters along the lagoon, so large that, from a distance, it looks more like a factory than a resort. At the time, it is the largest wooden hotel ever built in Florida. But the Royal Poinciana is not what Flagler is really selling. He is selling a controlled experience. That same month, the Florida East Coast Railway reaches West Palm Beach. Private rail cars from New York and Boston begin arriving every winter. Wealthy guests step off the train, board small boats, and cross to the island without ever facing swamps, mud, mosquitoes, or heat. For the first time, Florida has a season. Not a rainy season, not hurricane season, but a social season. 8 to 12 weeks each year when wealthy Northerners migrate south together. Palm Beach is no longer a destination. It becomes an appointment. But a stage like this needs a backstage, and Flagler understands that immediately. As soon as construction begins, problems appear. Hundreds of workers need housing. Thousands of staff will be required to serve guests. Laundry, food supply, repairs, transport. Palm Beach cannot absorb it, and Flagler does not want it visible. So in Mot Ngin Tam Tram Chin Moi Bon, he looks across the lagoon and makes a quiet but structural decision. He plans West Palm Beach, not as a resort, but as an operating zone. Worker housing, warehouses, repair shops, supply docks. The people who maintain paradise will live here. They clean rooms, cook meals, wash linens, carry luggage, repair roofs, then row back and forth each day to keep the stage across the water spotless and silent. Palm Beach faces the ocean. West Palm Beach faces the work. Not by law, by design, and the design works. Guests arrive in greater numbers. In Motengin Tam Tram Chin Moi Sao, Flagler opens the Palm Beach Inn on the ocean front, later renamed the Breakers. For the first time, guests do not look toward the lagoon, but directly out to the Atlantic. A massive pier extends into the ocean. Steamships from Havana, Nassau, and Key West dock regularly. Palm Beach now attracts not only American wealth, but international elites. By the early 20th century, winter in Palm Beach becomes ritual. To miss it is to fall behind. And then Flagler makes his clearest statement. In Motengin Chin Trum Hai, he builds Whitehall, his own 55-room private residence. Imported marble, a great hall modeled after European palaces. A declaration without words. Palm Beach is no longer a frontier. It is an enclave of power. But a contradiction emerges. Flagler creates paradise while remaining obsessed with control. Guests are meant to see perfection and never the cost behind it. The larger the backstage grows, the brighter the stage must appear. And that perfection creates new pressure. Island land becomes scarce. Winter homes rise in quiet competition. Each owner wants to outdo the last. Palm Beach no longer needs a stage builder. It needs a leading character. Someone not content to winter here, but determined to leave a mark greater than anyone before. And this is where the story turns. Because once the stage is complete, what it waits for is not more guests. It is ambition. Post-power in a man's world. May Motengin Shin Tram Moi Bon, Battle Creek, Michigan. A 59-year-old man takes his own life inside his private estate. His name is Charles William Post. In a single morning, the food empire he built from nothing passes to his only daughter. Her name is Marjorie Meriwether Post. She is 27 years old. The inheritance is worth approximately $20 million, an extraordinary sum in Motengin Tram Moi Bon, equivalent to hundreds of millions today. But money is not the hardest part. Power is. In Motengin Tram Moi Bon, American women cannot vote. Boardrooms are male territory. Wall Street is not accustomed to taking orders from a young woman. Post enters a world where she owns the company but is not automatically seen as the one who runs it. This is the first contradiction. She has the capital. She holds controlling shares. But survival requires a different strategy. Post does not confront the system head-on. She controls it from within. In the years that follow, the Postum cereal company is quietly restructured. Acquisitions begin. No spectacle, no publicity, just results. By the early 1920s, Postum is no longer a cereal company. It is becoming a rapidly expanding food conglomerate. And then comes a decision that changes everything. Motengin Chin Tram Hai Moi Chin. As the United States edges toward the Great Depression, Post makes a move many consider reckless. She acquires Birdseye, the pioneer of quick-freeze food technology, for roughly $22 million. Frozen food at the time is deeply mistrusted. Consumers doubt it. Grocers must invest in expensive freezers. The infrastructure barely exists. Even people close to her oppose the deal. But Post sees something others do not. She grew up in kitchens where women spend hours each day preserving food. Freezing is not just technology. It is the liberation of time, and time is power. The Birdseye acquisition does not simply make Post richer. It reshapes how America eats. Frozen food becomes normal. Supermarkets reorganize. The rhythm of domestic life changes. Postum is renamed General Foods. Marjorie Post becomes one of the most powerful businesswomen in the country, while rarely appearing as its public face. But economic power does not solve everything. Socially, Post remains an outsider. She has money. But Palm Beach belongs to old names families who decide what status looks like. Post attends the parties, but she does not control the room. This creates the second contradiction. She does not want to participate. She wants to define the rules. And this is where the story turns. Early 1920s, Palm Beach, Florida. The stage has already been built by Flagler. Wealth has arrived. Winter has become ritual. But every house here shares the same limitation. They face only one direction. Post wants something else. She brings her corporate mindset to Palm Beach and asks a cold, precise question. If you are going to build, why not build something no one else can have? A residence that does not merely sit on the island, but claims its entire width, from the ocean to the lagoon. That decision will produce the most expensive and most controversial private residence in Palm Beach history. But this is where the story turns. Mar-a-Lago as a machine Mot Ngin Chin Tram Hai Mui Wuba Mot Ngin Chin Tram Hai Mui Bay, Palm Beach, Florida. Marjorie Merriweather Post did not build Mar-a-Lago as a home to live in. She built it as a social operating system. From the beginning, Post did not look for a single architect. She divided the task into two distinct roles. Marion Sims Wyeth, trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, was responsible for structure, proportion, and long-term survival in a tropical climate. Wyeth ensured the building could withstand storms, humidity, and time itself. Joseph Urban, a Viennese stage designer who had created sets for the Metropolitan Opera and Broadway, was given everything else. Urban did not design for living. He designed for impact. Wyeth built the skeleton. Urban shaped the experience. Mar-a-Lago rose on a 17-acre parcel, stretching unbroken from the Atlantic Ocean to Lake Worth Lagoon, a geographic configuration that had become nearly impossible in Palm Beach by then. Beneath the sand lay a natural coral foundation, capable of supporting immense weight. Open ocean to the east, sheltered water to the west. Construction began in Mot Ngin Chin Tram Hai Mui Bon. At its peak, more than 600 workers labored on site. The coral bed was blasted with dynamite. Concrete was poured directly into the rock. 3 ships carrying Dorian limestone arrived from Italy. Urban chose the stone for a precise reason. It aged quickly, giving the new structure the appearance of long-established history. Inside, Post rejected standard solutions. 36,000 antique tiles, many centuries old, were laid by hand, one by one. The interior was not optimized for private living. It was optimized for human flow. Grand entrances created immediate impact. Long corridors stretched the experience. Reception rooms were arranged so crowds could separate and then naturally recombine. Service areas were pushed entirely out of sight. Staff moved continuously without ever entering the guest's visual field. When Mar-a-Lago officially opened in January Mot Ngin Chin Tram Hai Mui Bay, it immediately achieved something Palm Beach had never seen before. Within a single evening, the house could host multiple layers of activity at once. A grand dinner in the ballroom, private conversations in smaller salons, music in one wing, while fundraising or negotiations unfolded in another. Guests never collided. Staff never appeared. Movement happened without instruction. Mar-a-Lago did not simply entertain, it orchestrated. During the winter seasons of the late 1920s, anyone who mattered socially in Palm Beach appeared here. Industrialists, politicians, diplomats, major patrons of the arts. Mar-a-Lago became a place where relationships were activated, not merely displayed. For a brief period, the estate rewrote Palm Beach's social map. And at the height of that success, a quiet contradiction began to form. Because Mar-a-Lago was never built to close its doors. An ordinary house can sit idle when its owner is absent. Mar-a-Lago cannot. Every space requires staff. Every empty day still generates costs: electricity, maintenance, landscaping, wages. The house functions as designed only when people are inside: music, lighting, movement. When those elements stop, the expenses do not. This structure creates a precise paradox. A building constructed to project power depends entirely on being constantly used. It forces its owner to host, to entertain, to remain present. Mar-a-Lago is not a passive asset. It is a machine. And that machine does not adapt when its operating rhythm slows, when the owner grows tired, when life changes direction, when presence becomes irregular. The house does not shrink. It does not pause. It only becomes heavier. And from this point forward, the question surrounding Mar-a-Lago is no longer about power, but about long-term survival. When power reaches its height and begins to push back, Mot Ngin Chin Tram Hai Mui Bay Mot Ngin Chin Tram Bay Mui Bon, Palm Beach, Florida. During the winter seasons of the late 1920s, Mar-a-Lago was no longer just a prominent estate. It became a fixed point on Palm Beach's social calendar. No public invitations were needed. No announcements were required. Anyone who spent the winter in Palm Beach knew exactly where the most consequential evenings took place. Events at Mar-a-Lago were never improvised. Guest lists were carefully arranged. The order of appearances was calculated. Encounters that appeared accidental had usually been planned in advance. Marjorie Post did not remain in one place. She moved constantly through the rooms. A brief introduction. A pause held just long enough. An absence timed with intention. Social power here did not come from speeches, but from the ability to orchestrate people. During this period, Mar-a-Lago accomplished something no other private home could. It became the place where social decisions happened before they appeared at clubs or public functions. Who was brought closer? Who was connected? Who quietly began to drift to the edges? Palm Beach responded. Some long-established families did not stop attending Mar-a-Lago, but they did not fully embrace it either. They appeared less often, more selectively, and at a measured distance. Not because Mar-a-Lago lacked refinement, but because it exposed power structures too clearly, something Palm Beach had long preferred to disguise with subtlety. Then the outside world intervened. October Mong Chin Tram Hai Moi Chin, New York City. The stock market collapsed. Within weeks, names that had once appeared regularly in Palm Beach began disappearing from winter schedules, not always from immediate ruin, but from shifting priorities. Private rail cars were canceled. Entourages were reduced. Winter stays that once lasted 3 months ended several weeks earlier. Palm Beach did not vanish, but its rhythm changed, and Mar-a-Lago felt that change more acutely than anywhere else. A small estate could scale back. Mar-a-Lago could not. As attendance thinned, operating costs did not follow. Silence inside the large rooms became noticeable. Not abandonment, but deliberate emptiness. Marjorie Post continued to host events not to display wealth, but to prevent Mar-a-Lago from losing its central role. At the same time, another shift unfolded in her personal life. Mot Ngin Shin Tram, Ba Moi Lam. The marriage between Marjorie Post and E.F. Hutton ended. The partner who had helped build her economic power and understood the mechanics behind the scenes was no longer present. There was no public scandal, no visible confrontation. But Palm Beach sensed a subtle change. Post's appearances became less consistent. Some seasons she arrived later, left earlier. Mar-a-Lago remained open, but the rhythm was no longer perfectly calibrated. And this is where the story turns. Because Mar-a-Lago was never designed to exist independently of its owner. And for the first time, the question was no longer how magnificent Mar-a-Lago was, but what happens when the center of power is no longer held every day. By the late 1930s, Marjorie Merriweather Post was no longer regularly present in Palm Beach. Not because Mar-a-Lago had failed, but because her role had changed. In Mot Ngin Chin Tram, Ba Moi Bay, Post married Joseph E. Davies, a lawyer deeply embedded in Washington's political world, with direct connections to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. 2 years later, Davies was appointed United States Ambassador to the Soviet Union, one of the most sensitive diplomatic posts of the pre-war period. Post left Palm Beach, not for a single winter, but for many years in succession. Mar-a-Lago entered a state it had never experienced before. The house remained, but the person who set its rhythm was gone. During her years in Moscow, Post was no longer a social hostess. She became an organizer of diplomatic receptions between the United States and Stalin's government, under constant surveillance, suspicion, and political tension. Post's greatest skill was never architecture. It was the ability to orchestrate people. And that skill was no longer being used at Mar-a-Lago. Meanwhile, the house in Palm Beach had not been designed to wait. Without Post, there was no fixed social calendar, no continuous sequence of large-scale events to sustain its central role. Mar-a-Lago did not collapse immediately. It entered a more dangerous condition: loss of function. After World War II, Marjorie Merriweather Post returned to Palm Beach. Mar-a-Lago was still there, intact, maintained, nearly unchanged in appearance. But the rhythm was different. The winter season no longer automatically revolved around Mar-a-Lago. Social calendars no longer formed around weeks of uninterrupted entertaining. Invitations no longer defaulted to a single address. Palm Beach had learned how to operate without it. Major events shifted to smaller, more controllable spaces. Wealthy families chose venues that were easier to manage, less costly, and less dependent on a single individual. Mar-a-Lago remained an architectural masterpiece, but it was no longer the center of social power, and Post recognized that, not through a sudden shock, but winter after winter, as the house remained open without reclaiming its former necessity. And it was here that Mar-a-Lago's problems shifted from a social question to a decision that could no longer be avoided. Mot Nginchin Tram, Salmoy, Tam Mot Nginchin Tram, Bay Mui Ba, an operational problem no one could avoid Palm Beach, Florida. By the late 1960s, Marjorie Merriweather Post had entered her 80s. At the same time, Mar-a-Lago continued to operate according to the structure designed in the 1920s. Financial records from this period show that the minimum annual cost of maintaining the property exceeded Mot Dohong USD, simply to keep the estate in a usable condition. These costs included permanent staff salaries, maintenance of electrical, water, and climate systems, landscape upkeep, and baseline security. This figure did not decrease when the house was used less frequently. It only declined if the property were shut down entirely, a condition the building's design effectively prevented. Mar-a-Lago was not a residence that could be placed into dormancy. Its room layout, industrial kitchens, service wings, and storage facilities were built for continuous operation. As a result, regardless of the owner's presence, the expenses remained constant. Munginchin Tram, Samoichin, Mot Nginchin Tram, Bay Muai, Mut, impossible to inherit, difficult to sell Palm Beach, Florida. During the same period, Post began reviewing options for transferring ownership. Family inheritance was not viable. None of her children were willing or able to assume responsibility for a property requiring seven-figure annual operating costs. The option of selling the estate was equally complex. Real estate developers saw 17 contiguous acres stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to Lake Worth Lagoon, land suitable for subdivision and redevelopment. Preserving the existing structure, however, meant high conservation costs and strict development limitations. Private buyers lacked the capacity to maintain the estate's operational scale without fundamentally altering its character. In this context, demolition was not a remote possibility. Palm Beach had already witnessed the removal of several major estates from the 1920s after their upkeep costs exceeded their functional value. Mot Nguyen Chin Tram, Bay Moi Mot Mot Nguyen Chin Tram, Bay Moi High, proposal to the United States government, Washington, D.C. With private solutions increasingly constrained, Marjorie Post turned to another option, a proposed transfer of Mar-a-Lago to the United States government. The proposal was structured with clear legal terms. Mar-a-Lago would be donated to the federal government for potential use as a winter presidential retreat or a high-level diplomatic venue. The donation included a trust fund providing Motram USD annually to offset initial operating expenses. In Mot Nguyen Chin Tram, Ba Muai He, the United States Congress approved the acceptance. President Richard Nixon signed the authorizing legislation. From a legal standpoint, Mar-a-Lago officially became federal property. Mot Nguyen Chin Tram Bai, Moi Ba Mot Nguyen Chin Tram, Bay Moi Tam, operational assessments and withdrawal Palm Beach, Florida. Following the transfer, United States federal agencies conducted operational and security evaluations. The findings indicated that the trust fund covered only approximately 0.5% of annual maintenance costs. The remaining expenses would require ongoing federal budget allocations. Security assessments identified additional issues. Mar-a-Lago bordered public roadways. The surrounding area had not been designed for presidential security. Flight paths from Palm Beach International Airport passed nearby. The coastline remained open and difficult to secure. President Nixon already maintained a private retreat in Key Biscayne. He visited Mar-a-Lago only once during a brief inspection. Subsequent administrations did not incorporate the property into official presidential use. By the late 1970s, the United States government decided to return Mar-a-Lago to the Post family's designated organization. Direct consequences. When Mar-a-Lago re-entered the private market, it carried two distinct labels. From the government's perspective, it was a high-cost asset with limited functional efficiency. From the perspective of potential buyers, it was an operational risk. From this point forward, Mar-a-Lago was no longer viewed as a social symbol. It became an economic problem without a clear solution. Mot Nguyen Chin Tram Bay Moi, Chin Mot Nguyen Chin Tram, Tam Moi Lam, When Mar-a-Lago returned to the market Palm Beach, Florida, Montnyin Chin Tram, Bay Moy Chin, a property returned, but without a destination. By the late 1970s, after the United States government completed the legal process of returning ownership, Mar-a-Lago reverted to the control of the organization representing the Post family. Legally, the property had been released. Market-wise, it entered a vacuum. Mar-a-Lago was listed at Hai Moi Kong USD, including the main structure and 17 contiguous acres, stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to Lake Worth Lagoon. This was not an arbitrary figure. It reflected land value, location, and the historical construction cost of the estate. From the beginning, however, the central question was not the purchase price. It was the ability to continue owning it. Montnyin Chin Tram Bay Moi, Chin Montnyin Chin Tram, Tam Moi Mont, the problem after purchase. Operational records indicated that the minimum annual cost to maintain Mar-a-Lago remained above Moti Kong USD per year, simply to keep the property in usable condition. This figure did not include major system overhauls, safety upgrades, or renovations required to introduce new functions. For an individual buyer, this was no longer a residence. It was a system requiring continuous operation. For real estate developers, the estate presented a different constraint. Preserving the structure meant unsustainable costs. Subdivision was restricted by preservation rules and by an architectural layout that did not lend itself to division. From the outset, the pool of viable buyers was extremely limited. Mot Ngin Chin Tram, Tam Mua. Mot Ngin Chin Tram, Tam Mua agreements that appeared, then disappeared during this period. Mar-a-Lago repeatedly approached completed transactions. Preliminary agreements were drafted. Deposits were discussed, yet at the final due diligence stage, each deal collapsed. Technical assessments identified electrical systems, central air conditioning, roofing, and corrosion protection requiring additional investment estimated in the multiple millions of dollars to meet contemporary safety standards. When purchase price, repair costs, and long-term operating expenses were combined, the total exceeded the threshold that any reasonable use model could justify. In the early 1980s, interest rates in the United States rose sharply. Securing financing for a property that generated no income became nearly impossible. Mot Ngin Chin Tram Tam Moi, Ba Mot Ngin Chin Tram Tam Moi Bon, a structure standing still on the island's most valuable land. After repeated transaction failures, Mar-a-Lago entered a phase of minimal operation. Staff was significantly reduced. Sections of the grounds were closed. Landscape and interior maintenance was limited to basic preservation. On-site reports from this period documented deteriorating exterior paint, humidity-related interior damage, and gardens growing beyond strict control. Meanwhile, Palm Beach continued to develop. Land became increasingly scarce. Commercial value per square meter rose steadily year after year. The contrast became unavoidable. One of the island's largest land parcels was effectively frozen by the structure occupying it. Montnyin Chin Tram, Tam Moi Lam. A decision is made with a single administrative signature. A structure long considered untouchable for nearly 6 decades was formally placed on the demolition list. In early Mot Ngin Chin Tram, Tam Moi Lam, the managing organization concluded that no viable alternative remained. An application for a demolition permit was submitted to Palm Beach authorities. The proposed replacement plan was to subdivide the land for developments more compatible with prevailing market conditions. The permit was approved. At that moment, Mar-a-Lago was no longer viewed as a historic estate requiring preservation, but as a structure misaligned with contemporary ownership models. For the first time since its completion in Mot Ngin Chin Tram Hai Bay, the possibility of Mar-a-Lago disappearing entirely became a concrete scenario. But this is where the story turns. At the moment when no path forward seemed to remain, another individual evaluated the property in a fundamentally different way. Mot Ngin Chin Tram Tam Moi Lam Mot Ngin Chin Tram Chin Moi Lam Donald Trump and the deal that redefined Mar-a-Lago Palm Beach, Florida, New York, Mot Ngin Chin Tram Tam Moi Lam, when everything was ready to be demolished. By early Mot Ngin Chin Tram Tam Moi Lam, Mar-a-Lago was no longer under debate or reconsideration. The demolition permit had been formally filed with Palm Beach authorities. Administrative approvals had been signed. Replacement plans had passed legal review. Under the approved plan, the entire structure would be torn down and the Moi Bay contiguous acres subdivided into smaller residential lots, better aligned with Palm Beach's real estate market at the time. There were no formal objections, no state or federal preservation proposals. No buyers stepping forward to keep the building intact. At this point, Mar-a-Lago was no longer treated as a historic estate. It was evaluated strictly as a structure that could no longer operate efficiently and no longer fit contemporary ownership models. Its value had been recalculated, no longer architectural, no longer symbolic, but as raw land value in one of the most expensive locations in Palm Beach. Preparations for the next phase were already underway. The legal process was complete. The decision had been made. Mar-a-Lago, in practical terms, was counting down the final days of its first life. And it was at that precise moment that a new name appeared in the file. Donald Trump. In Motngin Chin Tram Tam Moy Lam, Trump was Ba Moy Chin years old. He had already established a reputation in New York through larger-scale real estate projects, high financial leverage, and unconventional ownership structures. Trump did not come to Palm Beach looking for a winter residence, nor did he approach Mar-a-Lago as a preservation effort. Records from earlier deals show a pattern. Trump was drawn to assets that had reached a point of deadlock, difficult to sell, expensive to maintain, and abandoned by the mainstream market. Mar-a-Lago met every one of those conditions. It had no buyers, no viable rescue plan, and an approved path toward demolition. To Trump, this was not a weakening asset. It was an asset that had already been sentenced. And that finality created an entirely different strategic opening. Trump did not approach Mar-a-Lago as a historic legacy. He approached it as a strategic asset. What caught Trump's attention was not the Spanish-style architecture or the gold-leaf interiors. It was the Moy Bay uninterrupted acres, stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to Lake Worth Lagoon. A land configuration that Palm Beach zoning rules would no longer allow to be recreated. Trump understood that even if the building disappeared, the land itself remained irreplaceable. And that realization marked the true beginning of the story. Mot Nayan Chin Tram, Tam Moy Lam, the deal that did not happen at the negotiating table, Palm Beach, Florida. Donald Trump did not enter Mar-a-Lago with an immediate purchase offer. Instead, he began with a move outside the main file. Directly along the eastern boundary of Mar-a-Lago ran a narrow strip of land facing the Atlantic Ocean. This parcel was not part of Mar-a-Lago, yet it sat precisely on the primary sightline from the estate's loggia and key living spaces. The land was owned by Jack Massey, the businessman who built Kentucky Fried Chicken into a national franchise. Trump approached Massey before returning to the Mar-a-Lago negotiations. In Motngin Chin Tram Tam Moy Lam, Trump purchased this beachfront strip for approximately high million US dollars. In terms of size, the parcel was modest. In strategic terms, it was decisive. Trump then announced plans to construct a residence on the newly acquired land. If carried out, the building would directly block the ocean view from Mar-a-Lago, not with a fence, not through litigation, but with a legally permitted structure. In Palm Beach, the value of coastal real estate is not defined by acreage alone. It is defined by the horizon. Once the horizon disappears, property value collapses with it. And here the balance of power began to shift. The Post Foundation understood the implications immediately. If Trump built on that parcel, Mar-a-Lago would lose more than symbolic value. It would lose its marketability altogether. No investor would purchase a property long marketed as from sea to lake, only to stand inside and face another man's roof. Negotiations reopened. This time, Trump was no longer the buyer seeking approval. He was the party controlling the bottleneck. Motngin Chin Tram Tam Moy Lam, when the numbers broke, the Post Foundation had originally listed Mar-a-Lago at high million US dollars. That figure reflected its architectural significance, historic status, and original construction costs estimated to exceed $1 million in modern terms. By late Motngin Chin Tram Tam Moy Lam, the question was no longer, what is it worth? It had become, who would still dare to buy it? Previous contracts had collapsed. Annual maintenance exceeded $1 million. Demolition permits were already approved. Trump submitted a revised offer. According to varying contemporary accounts, the total transaction value fell between Bay and Moy million US dollars, including both the real estate and the contents inside. Trump later wrote that he paid $9 million for the land and structure and Bay million for the furnishings. Some press reports at the time cited slightly higher totals, but all agree on one point. The final price was dramatically below the original listing. More striking still, independent appraisals valued the interior furnishings alone at approximately 10 million US dollars. In other words, the contents of Mar-a-Lago by themselves nearly equaled the entire purchase price. The deal closed in late Motngin Chintram Tam Moy Lam. The demolition permit was never executed. Motngin Chintram Tam Moy Sao when Mar-a-Lago opened its eyes again. Trump did not purchase Mar-a-Lago to preserve it unchanged. Immediately after taking control, he initiated a comprehensive restoration. Roofs were repaired, mechanical systems replaced, neglected gardens were cleared and replanted. Ivan Trump personally oversaw interior restoration. Specialized artisans were brought in, gold leaf, murals, and antique tiles were cleaned, stabilized, and repaired. After nearly a decade of dormancy, Mar-a-Lago returned to active use. But Trump quickly encountered a structural problem. Operating costs did not disappear. The estate had been designed for a social model that no longer existed. And this is where the story turns again. Because the solution Trump chose was not to shrink Mar-a-Lago, but to reinvent entirely how it would survive. Mot Ngin Chin Tram, Tam Moy, Bay Mot Ngin, Chin Tram, Chin Moy, Bai, when Mar-a-Lago became a gamble Palm Beach, Florida. Within a year of restoring Mar-a-Lago, Donald Trump confronted a reality he could not avoid. The estate could not sustain itself. According to operating records from the late 1980s, the annual cost of maintaining Mar-a-Lago ranged between high and below million US dollars, including staffing, maintenance, security, landscaping, and taxes. Even for an asset acquired at a discount, a prolonged negative cash flow was a serious risk. Trump tried the first option. He proposed subdividing the property, selling off portions of the land to offset operating expenses. The proposal was rejected by the Palm Beach Town Council. Mar-a-Lago had been classified as a property of special historic value. Subdivision would have destroyed the continuous spatial layout from ocean to lagoon that defined the site. Trump moved to a second option. He proposed a change in use. Under the new plan, Mar-a-Lago would no longer function as a single-family residence. It would become a private membership club, with members paying fees to access spaces previously reserved for one household. The proposal divided the community. Palm Beach had long operated as a tightly controlled enclave. Its social clubs enforced strict, unwritten rules governing membership, background, and religion. A Mar-a-Lago club would disrupt that order. Local officials feared increased traffic. Residents worried about outsiders. Established clubs viewed the plan as a direct challenge. Meetings stretched on for months. Documents moved back and forth. Conditions were added, then removed. Bedroom counts were capped. Membership numbers restricted. And then the story turned again. Motngin Chin Tram Chin Moy, Motngin Chin Tram Chin Moy, Mot, a crisis that forced the bet New York, Atlantic City, Palm Beach. While negotiations in Palm Beach stalled, Trump faced a far greater threat elsewhere. In the early 1990s, his real estate empire was pulled into a credit crisis. 3 casinos in Atlantic City were losing money. Trump Taj Mahal opened in Motngin Chin Tram Chin Moy with more than tam tram million US dollars in debt and quickly failed to generate sufficient cash flow. Banks began tightening credit. Total personal and corporate debt linked to Trump was estimated to exceed $1 billion US dollars at the peak of the crisis. Trump was forced to sell his private jet, sell his yacht, renegotiate loan after loan. In that context, Mar-a-Lago was no longer a symbol. It was a financial liability bleeding cash. But for that very reason, it became a final bargaining chip. Without a change in use, Mar-a-Lago would continue to drain resources. With approval, it could generate stable cash flow from membership fees, events, and services. Trump returned to negotiations with Palm Beach authorities. This time, there was little room left to delay. Motngin Chin Tram Chin Moy Ba, the decision that changed everything. Palm Beach, Florida. After multiple rounds of revisions, an agreement was approved in Motngin Chin Tram Chin Moy Ba. Trump was permitted to operate Mar-a-Lago as a private membership club under specific conditions. Membership was capped. Private residential areas were separated. Commercial activities were tightly regulated. It was not an absolute victory, but it was enough for Mar-a-Lago to survive. And that was the moment the gamble took a visible form. Because this decision did not merely save an estate, it fundamentally altered Mar-a-Lago's role in American social life. Yet the real question remained unanswered. Could a place designed for one individual continue to function as a stage for hundreds? And could Trump control the consequences of that choice? The answer only emerged after the club doors opened. Mot Ngin Chin Tram Chin Mui La Mot Ngin Chin Tram Chin Mui Chin. When the doors opened and the old order was challenged, Palm Beach, Florida. In Mot Ngin Chin Tram Chin Mui Lam, Mar-a-Lago officially reopened as a private membership club. The new operating model was designed around a single problem: cash flow. The initial initiation fee was set at high Mui Lam US dollars per member. Annual dues added several $1,000s more each year. Membership numbers were capped under agreements with local authorities. Donald Trump's private residential quarters were completely separated from the club's public areas. From a financial standpoint, the model began to work quickly. Within the first few years, membership fees and social events covered most of the operating costs that had once pushed Mar-a-Lago to the brink of demolition. But conflict did not come from the balance sheet. The first reactions came from groups that never appeared in any legal filing. Longtime residents of Palm Beach began raising concerns about increased traffic. Evening events ran later than before. New faces appeared in a place long accustomed to stability and seclusion. At the same time, traditional social clubs expressed a concern more discreetly. Mar-a-Lago, unlike them, did not apply the unwritten criteria that had shaped Palm Beach society for decades. Membership records show that the club accepted members without regard to religion and did not enforce background barriers once considered unwritten standards. Pressure gradually shifted toward the local government, not through protests, not through public complaints, but through administrative action. Between Motting In Chin Tram Chin Mui Sao and Motting In Chin Tram Chin Mui Bay, the town of Palm Beach issued a series of additional regulations applied specifically to Mar-a-Lago. Event hours were restricted. Guest limits were imposed on private functions. Staffing and operational requirements were inspected with noticeably greater frequency than at other clubs in the area. Formally, these measures were justified as efforts to protect community order. But when operating practices were compared, a discrepancy became clear. Other long-established clubs continued to exclude members based on religion or background, yet did not face comparable levels of oversight. And this is where the story turns. In Mot Ngin Chin Tram Chin Mui Bay, Donald Trump filed a lawsuit against the town of Palm Beach. The case did not center on business rights alone. It raised a broader issue: consistency in the application of the law. Trump argued that Mar-a-Lago was subjected to stricter limitations because of its open membership model, while other clubs with documented histories of exclusion were not held to the same standards. The lawsuit immediately drew attention, not because of property value, but because it exposed social structures that had operated quietly for decades. Civil rights organizations began to speak out. National media outlets placed Palm Beach at the center of a wider debate over discrimination within America's elite social institutions. Local authorities could no longer treat the matter as a routine administrative dispute. A series of closed-door negotiations followed. Eventually, the case was settled out of court. Certain restrictions on Mar-a-Lago were revised. The club continued operating under a new legal framework. But from that moment forward, Mar-a-Lago was no longer just a private club. It had become a public point of collision between wealth, power, and an older social order. Mot Ngin Chin Tram Chin Mui Chin Hai Nian Nam, when Mar-a-Lago moved beyond the role of a club, Palm Beach, Florida. After the Mot Ngin Chin Tram Chin Mui Bay lawsuit was settled, Mar-a-Lago was no longer operating in a defensive legal posture. Its regulatory framework was established. Administrative boundaries were clarified. The club entered a period of stability, and within that stability, Mar-a-Lago's role began to shift. By the late 1990s, what set Mar-a-Lago apart was no longer its amenities or its membership fees. It was who appeared there. Events became more frequent. Not just social gatherings, but meetings where figures from business, entertainment, and broader circles of influence shared the same closed space. Rooms originally designed by Marjorie Post to host heads of the state and diplomats were once again serving their original function, but without state authority. This was informal diplomacy, and this is where a new variable entered the story. Hai Nyin Hai, when attention extended beyond Palm Beach, Florida. Increased activity brought increased visibility from outside. Media references to Mar-a-Lago no longer centered on disputes, but on the recurring presence of familiar names. Mar-a-Lago ceased to be a purely internal social address of Palm Beach. It began to be perceived as a meeting place capable of shaping relationships. That shift introduced a quiet tension. A place whose value depended on controlling access was now gaining influence through how often it was mentioned. Not everyone welcomed the change. Local authorities began to review certain licensing provisions already in place. Not to shut Mar-a-Lago down, but to determine whether it was operating strictly as a club or as a space whose influence exceeded its original mandate. Administrative discussions followed. This time they were no longer confrontational. Mar-a-Lago had entered a different position. Isitum haingin bahingennam, when a private space became a public symbol Palm Beach of Florida. In the early 2000s, Mar-a-Lago appeared with increasing frequency in national media contexts. Not because of legal battles, not because of financial distress, but because of the events held inside. Large-scale parties, lavish weddings, gatherings that connected multiple layers of influence. In Hainganam, Donald Trump's wedding to Melania Naus was held at Mar-a-Lago. The event drew hundreds of guests, was closely followed by international media, and made one point unmistakably clear. Mar-a-Lago was no longer a property saved by a club model. It had become a public-facing symbol actively in use. Yet that visibility revealed its central contradiction. A place designed to control presence now depended on attention. And when attention became the primary source of power, the question was no longer whether Mar-a-Lago could survive. It became, what would it be used for next? The answer did not come from Palm Beach. It came from a much larger stage. Hai Nguyen Chin, Hai Nguyen Mui Lam, when Mar-a-Lago entered the political orbit. Palm Beach, Florida. The global financial crisis of Hai Nguyen Tom shook many of the world's traditional centers of power. Wall Street contracted. Washington faced instability. Public confidence in long-standing institutions weakened. In that context, Mar-a-Lago did not shut down. On the contrary, it continued operating steadily. But the shift was not in the event calendar. It was in who began to appear there. From Hai Nguyen Chin to Hai Nguyen Mui Hai, Mar-a-Lago saw increasingly frequent visits from politically connected business figures, campaign donors, and individuals operating on the edges of formal power structures. These were not public meetings. There were no minutes, no official statements, only dinners, private gatherings, and conversations taking place outside institutional oversight. Mar-a-Lago did not become a political headquarters, but it began functioning as a transitional space where relationships were formed before appearing on the public stage. And this is where a new tension emerged. Hai Nguyen Mui, Mot Hai Nguyen Mui, but private space and public power Palm Beach, Florida. Legally, Mar-a-Lago remained a private club. In practice, the interactions inside were no longer purely social. The presence of figures linked to policy, finance, and media blurred the boundary between private life and public power. No laws were broken, no regulations violated. Yet observers began asking a quiet question. Can a private space function as a conduit of power without being subject to the same scrutiny as public institutions? Mar-a-Lago did not answer that question. It remained open, and that silence only increased its appeal. Hai Nguyen Mui Bon. When power and image converged Palm Beach, Florida, New York. In Hai Nguyen Mui Bon, Donald Trump appeared more frequently in public political discussions. His statements drew media attention. Polling scenarios began to include his name as a potential political actor. At the same time, Mar-a-Lago was increasingly referenced as where Trump returned. Not the White House, not Washington, but a private property outside the traditional centers of power. This combination produced a notable paradox. A figure moving toward politics while positioning himself outside the system. A private space becoming progressively public in function. And this is where the story shifts again. Hai Nguyen Mui Lam, before the political door fully opened Palm Beach, Florida. Before Donald Trump formally announced his presidential candidacy, Mar-a-Lago had already completed a quiet transformation. From a mansion once slated for demolition, to a controversial club, then a social stage, and finally an informal gathering point for political power. No administrative decision assigned it this role, no legal document defined it, but meetings had taken place, relationships had been built, lines of influence had formed. And the question at this point was no longer where Mar-a-Lago was headed. It became, when formal politics begins, can a place designed to control access remain outside the spotlight? The answer would only emerge when Donald Trump crossed another boundary. A boundary that would no longer allow Mar-a-Lago to remain just a club. Haingin Moilam Haingin Hai Moi Mot. When Mar-a-Lago became the winter White House Palm Beach, Florida in June, Haingin Moilam, Donald Trump announced his candidacy for President of the United States. From that moment, Mar-a-Lago was no longer a peripheral backdrop. It began to appear directly within the flow of national politics. Haingin Moi. So a private space enters a public campaign, Palm Beach, Florida, Washington, D.C. Throughout the Haingin Moiso campaign, Mar-a-Lago continued to operate as a private membership club. But the nature of what occurred inside had changed. Political fundraising events, meetings with major donors, closed-door discussions with figures preparing to enter a future administration. There were no formal announcements, no publicly released schedules. Yet travel between Mar-a-Lago and Washington became increasingly frequent. And this is where a contradiction began to take shape. Haingin Moi Bay, when public power operated in a private space, Palm Beach, Florida. In January, Haingin Moi Bay, Donald Trump was sworn in as President of the United States. During the first year of his term, Mar-a-Lago was used as a working and hosting location outside Washington. Meetings with foreign leaders, briefings with senior advisors, policy discussions held within the grounds of a privately owned property. According to publicly available records, in Haingin Moi Bay alone, Trump spent more than Ba Moi days at Mar-a-Lago while serving as president. Federal security costs for each stay were estimated to reach millions of US dollars. And this is where the story takes a sharper turn. Haingin Moi Bay, Haingin Moi Tam, ethical tensions and public reaction, Palm Beach, Florida. Legally, Mar-a-Lago remained a privately owned property operating as a fee-based club. In practice, it became a space directly associated with public authority. Members could dine within the same compound where foreign policy matters were being discussed. Several controversial moments followed. Information about informal meetings surfaced through social media. Images from inside the club appeared, while national security issues were under consideration. The question was no longer theoretical. It became a public debate. Can state power be exercised within a space accessible only to those who can pay for entry? Haingin Moi Chin Haingin Hai Moi. When a symbol became a point of division, Palm Beach, Florida. From Haingin Moi Chin, Mar-a-Lago was no longer referenced simply as a presidential retreat. It became a politically polarizing symbol. Supporters viewed it as the image of a leader operating outside the traditional elite circles. Critics cited Mar-a-Lago as a clear example of blurred boundaries between public office and private interest. Small demonstrations appeared outside the property gates. International media outlets frequently referenced Mar-a-Lago in discussions of governmental ethics. And then, a global disruption arrived. Haingin Hai Moi Mot, when power departed and the space remained Palm Beach, Florida. The COVID Moi Chin pandemic disrupted nearly all social activity at Mar-a-Lago. Events were canceled. Club operations were scaled back. In January, Haingin Hai Moi Mot, Donald Trump's presidential term ended. No official announcement defined a new role for Mar-a-Lago. But one thing was clear. Formal power departed. The space remained. Mar-a-Lago returned to its status as a private property. Yet the imprint of the preceding years did not disappear. It had once been a mansion slated for demolition, a controversial club, a social stage, and for a defined period, an informal center of power. And this still does not explain the core question. What happens when a space designed to control access becomes a site where power is exercised publicly? The answer does not lie in a single term. It lies in the legacy Mar-a-Lago carries after power has moved on. Haingin Hai Moi, Mot Haingin Hai Moi, born after power, Palm Beach, Florida. In January, Haingin Hai Moi Mot, Donald Trump left the White House and returned to Mar-a-Lago. From that moment, the role of the property shifted again. It was no longer a center of executive power, but it did not return to being an ordinary social club. Haingin Hai Moi, Mo Power Without Office, Palm Beach, Florida. Throughout Haingin Hai Moi Mot, Mar-a-Lago became a frequent destination for Republican politicians, major donors, and figures with internal influence. There were no official titles, no formal authority, but meetings continued. Decisions about endorsements and campaign strategy were discussed inside a private space. And this is where the pace accelerates. Hai Ngin Hai Moi Hai, from power space to investigation site Palm Beach, Florida. In August, Hai Ngin Hai Moi Hai, federal agents executed a search at Mar-a-Lago. The investigation concerned the handling of documents after Trump left office. Government vehicles at the gate. Security perimeters tightened. Continuous media presence. Mar-a-Lago shifted from a symbol of power to a public investigation site, and this became an irreversible turning point. Hai Ngin Hai Moi Ba stretch symbol, Palm Beach, Florida. After the Hai Ngin Hai Moi Hai search, Mar-a-Lago did not fade from political life. Instead, it became a sharply polarized symbol. For one side, it functioned as a political hub. For the other, it illustrated blurred boundaries between personal power and public responsibility. No consensus emerged, but attention only increased. Hai Ngin Hai Moi Bon, an unanswered question. Palm Beach, Florida, by Hai Ngin Hai Moi Bon. Mar-a-Lago was no longer viewed through a single individual. It had become a case study. A private space that carried multiple roles over time, none of which were designed to supervise the power exercised inside. And the final question is no longer about Trump. It is about the space itself. Did power disappear, or did it simply change form? Mar-a-Lago has never answered, and its role may not be finished yet. Mar-a-Lago still stands today. Not collapsed, not erased, but no longer the place its creator once imagined. It was born as a display of wealth, then became a social instrument, later a strategic asset, and eventually a contested symbol. Not because of its architecture, not because of gold, stone, or acreage, but because of what has happened, what is still happening, and what may yet happen inside it. The story of Mar-a-Lago is not really about a building. It is about how power moves, about how money can reshape the fate of a space, and about how fragile the line between private property and public influence can become in a changing era. Some places are not built to rule, yet they become centers of influence. And some structures, even after losing their original purpose, continue to shape the story of their time. Mar-a-Lago is one of them. If you want to explore further how estates, spaces, and private assets created to project power often end up with far more complex destinies, the videos on screen will take the story even further. For now, if this story gave you something to think about, leave a comment and share your perspective. Don't forget to like and subscribe to keep following stories about power, money, and the spaces that shaped history. See you in the next video. It almost disappeared. The largest private home ever built in America stood on the edge of erasure less than 30 years after it was completed. Not because of war, not because of fire, not because of a shocking crime, but because it was too big to manage, too beautiful to destroy, and too expensive to be allowed to survive as a home. It sounds impossible. But that was the paradox of Biltmore House. Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1895. Snow blankets the Blue Ridge Mountains. A heavy iron gate opens in silence. A winding road climbs upward toward a structure built not to last a generation, but to last forever. More than 175,000 square feet of floor space, 250 rooms, 35 bedrooms, 65 fireplaces, a single roof spanning over 4 acres. This scale was meant to feel immortal, but that same scale turned the house into a machine that had to be fed every single day. Coal burning without pause, steam circulating through miles of pipes, hundreds of people working in corridors no guest would ever see, and above all, a stream of money that could never be allowed to stop. The moment that money slowed, beauty became a burden, and size became a threat. So who really paid for Biltmore when it was too massive to tear down, but too costly to keep alive? And how high was the price to keep this dream breathing? This is not a story about wealth on display. It is an investigation into cost, into sacrifice, and into the moment an American icon, built to be eternal, nearly vanished from history. If you enjoy deep investigations into architecture, power, and the hidden cost of grand dreams, please like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. Because to understand why a house designed to last forever proves so fragile, we have to go back in time to the man who decided to build the largest home America had ever seen. Who dreamed this dream? George Washington Vanderbilt to George Washington. Vanderbilt II was born in 1862 into a family that was not merely wealthy, but powerful at the level of national infrastructure. The Vanderbilt fortune did not sit in vaults or isolated properties. It lived in railroads, in shipping lines, in the ability to control how goods and people moved across the United States. By the late 19th century, the Vanderbilt name represented a new kind of wealth. Wealth built on systems, not spectacle. George was born into that world, a world where money itself was never the question, only how it should be used. But George differed from many heirs of his generation. While other members of the Vanderbilt family built summer cottages in Newport and townhouses in New York to assert social status, George avoided that stage. He disliked parties. He avoided attention. And he appeared rarely in elite social life. Instead, he spent his time with books. From his early 20s, George read European history, philosophy, natural science, agriculture, and especially texts on land and forest management. His personal library would eventually exceed 22,000 volumes. But the significance was not the number. It was the purpose. George was not learning how to spend money. He was learning how to organize space, to organize resources, to organize labor, and to organize time on a long horizon. In the late 1880s, George began extended trips through Europe. He did not travel for leisure. He traveled to observe. He studied large estates that had survived for generations, how they produced their own food, how forests were managed without depletion, how houses, farms, and landscapes functioned as a disciplined whole. What captivated George was not beauty, it was order. From these observations, a central idea began to form. He did not want a house. He wanted a system. At the time, most wealthy Americans built homes for seasonal living or for social display. These mansions could be large, beautiful, and expensive, but when their owners left, they simply closed. George Vanderbilt wanted something different. He wanted a working estate, an estate that actually functioned, not merely a place to live, but a place that operated. Food produced on site, forests managed on long-term plans, labor organized as a system, not just a staff of servants. George did not seek complete self-sufficiency. His goal was to reduce dependence on outside markets and social systems. This way of thinking stood apart from his era. By the early 1890s, the idea was no longer abstract. The dream had taken shape, an estate large enough to operate year-round, enough land to test scientific forestry, enough space to organize agriculture, labor, and logistics as a single organism. And to make this possible, George needed a center, not a farm, not a forest, but a house capable of holding his library, his art collection, and serving as the coordinating core of the entire system. Here, George made a decision that would define everything that followed. He chose to build the largest private home ever constructed in America. This decision did not betray his dream. It emerged directly from it. But from that moment, a quiet contradiction was planted. Because a system designed for efficiency demands flexibility, cost control, and adaptability. While a structure of unprecedented scale requires enormous fixed costs from the very first day, long before the surrounding system can generate any value at all, the contradiction did not explode immediately. There was no crisis, no collapse, but it existed embedded in the blueprint. And once Biltmore began operating, that contradiction would no longer remain theoretical. Construction. Beauty is only the surface. In 1890, when much of the United States still lacked reliable residential electricity, a private structure was designed to operate with an energy footprint, comparable to a small town. Not a factory, not a hospital, but the operational center of a private estate. That decision, from the very beginning, defined the fate of Biltmore House. George Vanderbilt did not look for an architect to build a house. He looked for someone who could design scale. His choice was Richard Morris Hunt, a Beaux-Arts-trained architect known for projects that served power and symbolism. Hunt selected a French chateau vocabulary, not for ornament alone, but because it was an architectural language designed to convey permanence, inheritance, and long-term ownership. Materials followed the same logic. Indiana limestone for the exterior walls, durable, weather-resistant, and suitable for precise carving. Copper roofing, expensive up front, but calculated to last for generations without replacement. American oak for structure and interiors, chosen for stability under constant thermal variation. But form was only the outer layer. To realize it, George had to create a temporary industrial ecosystem before any living space could exist. A private rail spur was driven directly to the construction site. Brickworks and woodworking shops were established on the property. At peak construction, more than 1,000 workers labored simultaneously for years. This was not residential construction. It was infrastructure deployment. In parallel, George entrusted the landscape to Frederick Law Olmsted. Olmsted did not design gardens. He restructured land. Decades of logging and exhausted farming had left erosion, depleted soil, and denuded hillsides. Olmsted's design aimed at ecological recovery, so the estate could function over the long term, not simply photograph well. The approach road was lengthened and curved, concealing the structure until the final reveal. Landscape and architecture were conceived not as separate elements, but as a single operating system. Yet the decisive factor at Biltmore was not stone, wood, or scenery. It was technology. The entire structure was electrified. Elevators ran on electric power. Fire detection systems were integrated. Service call bells were installed in principal rooms. Most critical of all was the central steam heating system. Industrial-scale coal-fired boilers were placed in the basement, producing steam circulated through miles of piping to stabilize temperatures across a structure spanning more than 4 acres under one roof. This was hospital and factory technology, not residential. And at this point, Biltmore's true nature became clear. Biltmore was not a house, it was a machine. A machine that required daily fuel, continuous staffing, and could not simply shut down when the owner was absent. Even with no guests, even with no social activity, costs continued to accrue. Here the central contradiction of the story emerged. An estate designed for long-term self-operation had placed at its core a machine with enormous fixed costs from the very first day. The question was no longer how beautiful Biltmore was. The question became how much money a structure like this had to burn every single day just to continue existing. And the answer to that question lay in corridors never meant to be seen by the public. The invisible world that kept Biltmore alive. In 1895, for Biltmore to function through a single day, more than 100 people had to begin working before the owner ever stepped down the grand staircase. They did not pass through the Great Hall. They did not use the main entrance. Biltmore was built with 2 circulatory systems, one for the owner and the guests, one for labor. Behind thick stone walls, a network of service corridors ran parallel to the formal rooms. Narrow, steep staircases, stripped of decoration, connected the basement to the attic above. These passageways had no carpets, no ornamental lighting. They were just wide enough for a single person carrying a tray or pushing a cart. Morning at Biltmore did not begin with sunlight. It began with coal. Before dawn, deep in the basement, the boilers were already running. Every day, tons of coal were shoveled by hand to maintain steam pressure for the central heating system. If that pressure dropped, the temperature in the rooms above changed almost immediately. A small failure in the boiler room could chill an entire structure spanning more than 4 acres under one roof. A short distance away, the laundry operated like an industrial plant. Bed linens, tablecloths, and curtains were washed and replaced constantly. Not for a family, but for a building with 250 rooms. Large steam-powered washing machines ran continuously. Hot water had to be available at all times. If the laundry slowed, the rooms above would lack essentials that same day. There was no margin for delay. On the upper floors, maids, footmen, and house managers moved according to fixed schedules. Breakfast had to appear on time. Fireplaces had to be lit before rooms were used. Service bells connected guest rooms directly to the hidden operations behind the walls. This entire system was recorded in handwritten logs and shift schedules. There was no automation,